Well, if you could Formula One-ify the industry, I would imagine it would be way more money, but maybe not.
There is a young guard in racing that is really frustrated that, the sport is not doing a better job of innovating in terms of how it produces revenue stream, how it attracts fans, how it presents itself.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.
What is up, everybody? I am Jason Trost, the host of the Business of Betting podcast. I've got a very special guest today, Katie Bo Lillis, who has a book coming out called The Death of a Racehorse. Welcome to the pod, Katie.
Hi, Jason.
Hi. Where are you calling in from?
I am calling in from a little pocket of very rural Northern Virginia, kind of right up in the corner next to West Virginia. So I'm out in the country. I'm looking at my barn out the window right now.
Would Sarah Palin call where you live real America or not real America?
Definitely real America, but you cannot see Russia from my back porch.
Okay, fair enough. And I should mention you have another job as a senior intelligence reporter for CNN. So very exciting stuff. So in this book that you got coming out, I saw you dedicated this to your mom. I Googled your mom and I saw that she's from horse racing. So this must be in your blood. What's your background of horse racing?
Yeah, I grew up with just kind of backyard horses, fox hunters, show horses. But when I was in high school, my mom said, you got to get a summer job. And I don't care what it is, but if you want, I'll get you a job working at the racetrack. And she, at the time, was a state regulator for horse racing because horse racing is a gambling sport, right? It has traditionally been regulated state to state, and she was a commissioner at the time. So she got me a job as a 16-year-old doing what's called walking hots at the track, which is to hand walk horses after they exercised to cool them down. And I loved it.
Very cool. And I think one of your first jobs was writing about horses or about bloodstock. Is that correct?
I kind of worked hands-on with the animal on the ground and eventually exercising them and then working in kind of the sales industry side of things. So the part of the business that breeds and then sells the horses that go on to become racehorses, summer jobs, college jobs, straight out of college for years, and then did a little bit of writing for a racing rag in Saratoga Springs, New York, called the Saratoga Special, that if you are in Saratoga and like horse racing, you should definitely be reading.
Very cool. Sounds exciting. So I'm very excited to talk because horse racing is a substantial part of our business. We make millions from horse racing, and I actually know very little about the sport itself. So let's start off with a simple question. I hear the term thoroughbred racing all the time. I have no idea what thoroughbred means. Can you define a thoroughbred for the audience?
That's a great question. Okay, so think about how there's lots of different dog breeds, right? You have Golden Retrievers, you have German Shepherds, whatever, and they all are governed by a breed registry, and they're very, very distinct in their kind of physiological characteristics. Thoroughbred is a breed. So when you hear people talk about quarter horse racing, quarter horses are a completely different breed of horse. Thoroughbred is one breed. You have quarter horses. The horses that you see racing, pulling the little carts called standardbred racing or harness racing, that's a whole different breed of horse. They're called standardbreds. But thoroughbreds they're the blue bloods. They are the sort of elegant, long-legged, owned by the, elite of the country going back decades, even hundreds of years. And they run longer is their big.
I always thought it meant, I would have guessed thoroughbred meant it was like the upper echelon of breeds. I didn't realize thoroughbred was a breed itself. What are Arabian horses? I thought a lot of horse races were Arabian.
There are also Arabian horse races. That's a whole different breed of animal, really popular in the Middle East. I actually don't know if we do it in the United States. I know a lot of people have Arabian horses, but it's definitely very popular in the UAE and elsewhere.
And what about UK and Irish and French racing? What kind of horses do they use?
They're thoroughbreds. Enormously popular. Thoroughbred racing is done all over the world. So enormously popular in the UK and Ireland, of course. Ireland especially really traditional home of the thoroughbred horse. Then Australia racing also, flat racing is also, or thoroughbred racing is also really popular there. Hong Kong actually has a very, very high dollar thoroughbred racing meet, but it is also done in some smaller unexpected places. France, Germany, there are some Central Asian nations that have thoroughbred racing. So it's all over the world.
Great. Well, let's kick off with the intersection of sports betting and horse racing. So from my naive perspective, we take bets on everything, whether who's going to be the next president, who's going to win the soccer football match, who's going to score the first goal, all these kinds of things. And in our business model, we have to pay for official data from time to time in order to get the data and who scored the goal or what minute this action happened. But we don't have to, sports betting is a derivative work. So much similar to journalism. Like if I write an article about Arsenal Football Club or this or that horse, I don't have to go and pay the horse racing owner or the football team to write about that team. But at least in the UK, and I think it's somewhat the case in the United States, there's a law that actually says that a portion of your revenue has to go back to the sport in the UK. It's called the horse racing levy. And I know it's regulated state by state in the United States, but I think there's strong connections between the revenue of the bookmaking operator and the gambling revenue that goes back to the horse racing. Now, I know to me, horse racing doesn't exist without sports betting, so I can understand there's that kind of symbiotic link. It's also a legacy sport. It's probably one of humanity's oldest sports, and certainly one of the oldest gambling sports. But for me, that linkage of that, the revenue from the bookmaker, statutorily has to be paid back to the industry, to me sits quite uncomfortably. What is your perspective of the link between sports betting or bookmaking and gambling from your perspective?
Well, the short answer is that at least in the United States, and I'm going to kind of cabin what I talk about to the US, horse racing does not exist without gamblers. What's called the takeout, right, which is the portion of the overall handle that covers both, the cut that goes to the state and the cut that goes to racetrack operators, that's what funds the entire sport, right? So if you don't have the revenue from wagering dollars, right, you don't have a way to mount purses, for example. So then you don't have an incentive for people to run in these races because they have no way of earning any money. The racetracks themselves can't keep their lights on, right? So the whole kind of machine in terms of literally just putting on the show requires gambling dollars. That's how it is funded. From the racetrack operator's perspective, and candidly from the participants' perspective, so from owners, trainers, jockeys who are running for purse money, right? It doesn't really matter who wins in terms of takeout. As you know very well, obviously, wagering on thoroughbred horse racing is parimutuel. So
in the US.
In the US, yes.
In the UK, they have both models. They have a fixed odds betting model and a parimutuel model.
Yes, exactly. And I will say I know far less about that second model than I do about parimutuel wagering in the United States. For the racetrack, right? If they don't have full competitive fields that offer a attractive gambling product for handicappers, they can't keep the lights on. That is their funding revenue. That is their funding mechanism. I
understand that's historically the case, but I guess from my younger generation theoretical point of view, to me, it makes no sense that horse racing needs, I understand that the existing business model of horse racing is predicated upon getting this forced revenue, I guess, back from gambling revenue. I understand that, but to me, it makes no sense. And what I've noticed, it's no secret that horse racing is in decline. I think in the UK, it's in slow decline, but it's definitely in decline. It's a little bit like AOL dial-up. We still will have horse racing in 50 years, but I think it's...
Maybe not.
And maybe not. Well, we'll see. But what I don't understand from horse racing is, to me, I don't think that there should be a link between sports betting and horse racing. I think that's it's a little bit of a handicap, pardon the pun, keeping horse racing back because they're not innovating in terms of the way they present the horses or sponsorships. Or I like in horse racing, to me, it should be a lot like Formula One, because to me, Formula One at its core is a super boring sport. You got guys in helmets going around in a circle in a car. Okay. But they have done such an amazing job. Tom Cruise is there and it's sunny and, that guy's got a Rolex, and they do such a great job of ginning up the human interest story. And I think horse racing has done such a bad job about that, even though I make a substantial amount of my revenue from horse racing, I can name one trainer, two trainers, one jockey, two jockeys. There isn't that kind of human element. So I'm kind of against the link between sports betting and horse racing from a statutory perspective. And I also think it handicaps the sport.
Okay, so you've actually hit on something that racing itself has really, really struggled with, which is how do you create both a fan-friendly experience that's a day out where Tom Cruise wants to show up, right? And simultaneously, how do you get people to have sustained interest in individual participants, right? Because one of the sort of structural challenges that makes it really hard to kind of tell a narrative that you can follow all the way through the season is any one of these big horses they might run 6 times in their entire career, separated by 3, 4, 6 months, at a time. And then they're gone. Then they're off to the breeding shed because they're in fact more valuable as breeding prospects than they are racehorses earning purse money. And so at the really elite levels, the kind of top marquee races that are really, really exciting to watch, like there's just so much time in between them, and a given horse is only on the scene for, a year, 2 years at most, right? Trainer, simultaneously, you have this issue where it's, okay, let's get somebody interested in the trainer. Let's get somebody interested in the jockey. They are on a completely different horse, running in a completely different race every 20 to 30 minutes. It's also very hard to tell a sort of sustained narrative around that because you have this kind of constantly shifting allegiances. One of the reasons why it's really hard to get kind of the league model to work in horse racing is because you basically have, there's roughly 30,000 horse races that are run in the United States every year. Most of them are not, the Kentucky Derby, the Breeders' Cup, the Preakness, Saratoga, those big marquee races. Most of them are sort of work-a-day, blue-collar, huge number of races just to try to get the handle up. Those owners, trainers, jockeys, like they're competing in all of those races sort of throughout the year. It's a very sort of diffuse, frenetic product. It's basically like having a bazillion and one small businesses. This trainer is training for 4 different owners. Maybe that owner hates that owner. It's not a unified sort of structure. You can't package a group of horses and say, okay, this set of horses is on this sort of racetrack, and that, sorry, not to use a terrible pun, but, this series of this track for this series of races, because one of those horses might break down. He might go over here. He might wind up being better on the grass than on the dirt. And so he's got to go do a completely different thing. So it becomes very, very hard to build these sort of sustained league structures that would then allow you to develop alternative means of funding purses and funding the sport.
Has anybody tried a league structure? Because, to your point about horse races are good for 1 to 2 years, that's a convention. I mean, there's nothing stopping a horse race from running 5. I don't know what the life expectancy is, but 20 years, a horse race.
Yeah. Oh no, a horse. The life expectancy of a horse is, they can live into their 20s. But with the elite horses, the really, really good ones, and this is the really important thing to understand about the horse business, the people who are participating in the sport, so the owners, basically the people who own these animals, right? The big bucks for them are not made by winning purse money. The big bucks for them are made by breeding and trading racing prospects. So a good example is, let's use a horse called Flightline, who was probably one of the most brilliant horses of his generation, certainly one of the most brilliant horses that I've ever seen run. He ran exactly 6 times in his entire career because ultimately, he was retired, I believe, as a 3-year-old. He might have run into 4, but early in his lifespan, right? He was ultimately syndicated as a stallion prospect for millions and millions and millions of dollars because his real value is to go be a breeding stallion. As a breeding stallion, a top breed, one of the tippy top breeding stallions in Kentucky, they might breed 200 mares a year at $250,000 a pop. You do the math. It's a lot of freaking money. So the incentive is to pull the horse off at the top levels, is to get the horse off the racetrack and in the breeding shed.
So in theory, the Flightline could have kept running. They just didn't want to put the horse at risk for breeding. Is that correct?
Well, they kind of had 2 things going on. They didn't want to put the horse at risk of injury or losing a few races and damaging the buzz around him and therefore damaging commercial appeal. Now, I want to be clear. I'm speaking as an observer of this. I haven't had explicit conversations with the syndicate that made the decision to retire Flightline. I'm using him kind of as a totem stand-in example here. But generally speaking, when you have a really buzzy horse like that, the risk is that the animal's going to lose a race. And then all of a sudden he doesn't look quite so good. And maybe that multi-million-dollar stallion deal that you were putting together, 42 share syndicate agreement, look, you're not selling those shares for quite as much.
But I guess to my point that horse racing is missing a trick, that there's nothing systemic, I guess, stopping horses from running longer, so that you can build up a following. So the racing could change. I also imagine Flightline is a special case because, if he's the Tom Cruise of horse racing daddies, I assume most horses are not getting $250 a pop for all their babies.
To be clear, I'm not sure what his stud fee is right now, but that's the tippy top of the industry for sure. But those are the most interesting horses to watch run, right? If you if you want to go see a Formula One race, you want to go see the best drivers, right?
Yeah, I get the whole idea that this horse will be pulled aside to be breeding, but two things. One, there aren't that many horses that are getting that much of a stud fee. And two, there's nothing implicit that stops a horse from running longer to sort of build that following for the betterment of the sport.
Yeah, physically no. And like you actually hear participants in the sport complain about this a lot. Oh, God, I wish they would just keep that horse in training. It'd be so good for the sport. We would attract more fans, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, I think you tend to see people come down on the side of,
Well, if you could Formula One-ify the industry, I would imagine it would be way more money, but maybe not. Maybe the intrinsic interests are set and everybody makes enough money. So
there is a young guard in racing that is really frustrated that, the sport is not doing a better job of innovating in terms of how it produces revenue stream, how it attracts fans, how it presents itself. And like one of the big places that you are seeing this fight play out is like, to your point about statutory earmarks, right? One of the big challenges that the sport has is people are, racing used to have a monopoly, right, on legalized sports gambling in the United States. It doesn't anymore. We don't need to go through all of the different iterations that has led to this where we are now. But since a high watermark in the early 2000s, overall handle on horse racing has plummeted 50%, right? So racing knows that it has lost gambling dollars. And as states kind of on a case-by-case basis began to legalize casino wagering, one of the ways that states legislatures got around kind of the opposition of sort of sin industry opponents, right, was that they yoked a certain portion of casino revenue and earmarked it to go towards racing operations, to go towards augmenting purses. And part of the reason they did this, like I said, was to basically get casinos legalized and sort of piggyback them in on, the fact that gambling on racing was already legalized. But another reason that they did this, of course, is that racing supports a tremendous number of agricultural jobs in a given state. So state legislatures are generally supportive of racing, right? Because they provide, they give the hay man a job, the hay farmer, the blacksmith putting shoes on. They create a lot of agricultural jobs. So they therefore also create a lot of tax revenue. The problem is that as these arrangements have aged, casinos have started to look around and be like, look, why are we propping up a dying industry? Why is our revenue going over here to horse racing that can't get its act together and figure out how to attract new fans and boost its own, whose handle is falling? And you have already seen signs in some states that arrangement may go away. There's legislation currently advancing in the Florida state legislature. It's called decoupling, that would sort of delink racing from casino operations. There are racetrack operators that are actually supportive of this because they know that their property is probably more valuable as something else other than a racetrack. There is I say all this to get to the point of there's a huge amount of frustration with a lot of sort of younger owners, trainers, breeders, sort of horse side practitioners of the sport, that the industry is not doing a better job of doing exactly what you're saying, which is how do we figure out how to better make money on this?
Well, I'm not an insider like you, but from my perspective, it's a no-brainer because it's not a bad product when I've been to a few high-end horse racing in the UK and it is a lovely day out, whether it's Ascot or Cheltenham it's a lovely day out. It's you go out, you have a drink, you're in the sunshine. It's kind of like a baseball vibe where you can pay attention for a little bit and then have a conversation the rest of the time. It's a nice day out, but I think the sport is very kind of working against its own best interests the way it's operating, and they're not growing the sport. And certainly, I think they're doing harm to the sport.
I mean, I think that's right. I think one of the big challenges is sort of a big day out, right? The amount of money that a racetrack earns from sort of just the event component of horse racing is not sufficient to support purses at a level that makes it viable for the horsemen competing in them. It's enormously expensive to maintain a racehorse throughout the year. It's tens of thousands of dollars every year, and that's not including the purchase price of the animal, right? And so, you have to have, purse money has to be high enough that the people running these horses can get out. And right now, the event structure is not enough, alone is not enough to support.
Right. Pivoting topics, in the UK, I'm more familiar with UK horse racing than US horse racing, but I assume you've heard of the Grand National, which is a big race in the UK every year. So it's very famous for these insane hedges. It's a super long race. I don't know if it's 3 or 4 miles or something like that. And very infamously or famously, usually 1 or 2 or 3 horse races die every year because the horses fall, they break a leg. And I think in the parlance of horse racing, they call it a horse has to be destroyed, which is a very...
What's the UK term?
It's a very weird way to say they have to euthanize the horse. as an insider or somebody from this world, how do you want people from outside horse racing to feel about the welfare of horses and the sport? How should people think about horses dying in the pursuit of revenue?
Yeah. No. It's the central ethical question of thoroughbred horse racing. And I should, while we're educating everybody on thoroughbreds, the horses that run in over fences are also thoroughbreds.
Okay. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, we're still talking about thoroughbreds here. And there's a lot of jumps racing in the United States as well. It's very popular in the East Coast, but it's the central ethical challenge that horse racing has because, of course, people think of horses, most people, right, who don't have any sort of day-to-day exposure to this animal, right? They think of them as what they are, which is these fiercely intelligent, sensitive, sentient beings. They think of them like dogs and cats. They think of them like pets because for most people outside of the horse racing industry, that's what they are. If you have a horse, you essentially own a very expensive pet. You're using it for your own pleasure. You're not using it to make money off of. Within the horse racing industry, and I use the word industry intentionally, these animals have a lot more akin to livestock than they do to pets because they are used to make a living. I personally believe that is a justifiable state of affairs. Racing does produce an enormous number of agricultural jobs that probably wouldn't exist if horses didn't exist on an industrial scale. However, and this is my personal view, you have to have the correct guardrails put in place to protect the animal from kind of the brute incentive structure of the marketplace, right? Horses don't, unlike cattle or chickens, horses don't feed us. They don't clothe us. They don't keep us alive in any vital way. They only exist for our entertainment, and the standard of care, therefore, has to be higher. There have to be regulations in place to ensure that the way that the care that the animal is given for the benefit of the animal, not for the purpose of getting the animal back to the races to earn more money. Racing, and this is a national phenomenon, but I'm going to be sort of specific to the United States and how I talk about this. Racing is working really hard to basically do better on that very point. The United States has had a very high breakdown rate. It's in flat racing specifically. It's on the order of hundreds of horses per year. That number as a percentage has been steadily declining, but it is still too high. And in particular, in 2023, you saw a number of really high profile breakdowns at Churchill Downs leading up to the Kentucky Derby. You might remember some of the news coverage. There was also some at Saratoga in New York, this very elite blue blood track in New York. That really horrified people. In 2023, there was new legislation that was passed. It was passed in 2020, but it went into effect in 2023 that basically federalized the regulation of kind of the welfare and safety side of horse racing. And they've had some pretty significant impacts. It's things like increased veterinary oversight, for example, standardized testing for drugs. They've done kind of a lot of things over a lot of different kind of components of racing, but it's added up to a big change. They had a 27% drop in fatalities in the first full year they were operational from 2023 to 2024. So change is possible and the industry is working on this. There are certainly going to be people who are never going to get comfortable with the idea of using the animal in this way and believe that even one fatality is too many. As I said, I sort of personally think that if we can push the point of regulation, and enough has not been done, right? There are additional changes that can be made that are going to better shield the animal, or there's more that has to be done. But that's the direction that the sport is trying to head in because, candidly, it understands it's a business prerogative. They know we don't want to go the same way that SeaWorld has gone, or that Barnum and Bailey has gone, or that Greyhound racing went, for example.
In the Grand National, as far as I understand, and I'd love to get your take on this to educate me about horse racing, oftentimes they'll do a jump, they have a bad fall because these, if you're based in America and you've never seen Grand National, these jumps are enormous. They're insane.
You could not pay me enough, and I jumped some big fences.
They're insane. It looks like you need a trident and a crossbow, and you're in the ring in the Coliseum watching some of these things. So my understanding is that horse, understandably falls, they trip, they break a leg, and then they get euthanized. Can you explain to the audience why horses are so quick to get euthanized when they break a leg? Because to the novice person, it seems like just put a cast on them and
He's really cruel.
Put them out to pasture or something.
No, they literally can't survive with a broken leg. And the reason there's 1,000,001 bones in there. So there are some fractures that horses do heal from, but what are called catastrophic injuries, and I won't go into which bones they are, but basically the catastrophic ones, certain injuries. The horse's lower leg has basically no blood flow in it. There's a couple of reasons, but one of them is that the horse's lower leg has basically no blood flow in it. So when you have an injury of that kind, it's very, very hard for enough blood to get down there to heal the injury. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is horses' system. So like their leg will literally, this is gross, but like their leg will literally rot off. Like it is inhumane to keep them alive, right? The other piece of it is that horses are meant to move. Their whole digestive system is built off of it. So you can't cast a horse and hold them still. The same thing will happen. Their feet will basically rot off. Their digestive system will fall to pieces. Their whole bodies are kind of designed to constantly be walking, moving on their feet. Horses sleep standing up, for example. So you can't just sort of put a horse in a cast and be like, okay, you now lie in this bed for, 30 days while this heals. That's what will kill them.
I've seen plenty of dogs with 3 legs. Horses can't operate with 3 legs.
No, there have been some, and you're going to pull me slightly out of my field here because I'm not a veterinarian, but there have been some individual cases of veterinarians starting to try to experiment with with artificial limbs. They have, to my knowledge, are not widespread and have not gone terribly well.
I didn't know that about the blood. That's quite interesting. In terms of like the controversial deaths that happened in America, I'm not an expert in it, but I understood not all of it was with racing broken legs. I think some of it was heart attacks or drug related. Can you talk about what those deaths were caused by?
Yeah. So you hear about this in human athletes too. They call it sudden death in horses, but young athletes, both human and equine, will occasionally experience a heart arrhythmia. It's basically a misfiring of the electrical circuits in your heart. It's not a heart attack, which is a blocked artery, right? It's not a clogged pipe. It is literally electrical, and it will kill them. It is very mysterious in both humans and horses. People don't really understand exactly why it happens, because it quite often happens to animals that have no previous pathological history. There's no reason to think that this would have happened. It also doesn't leave, because it's electrical, it doesn't leave a pathology that you can study. So it's very, very difficult for scientists doing the necropsy afterwards to kind of reconstruct, why did this happen? It is a small number of horses. It obviously gets a lot of attention when it happens because it's so freak, but it does happen. One instance that caught particular attention took place in 2019. Early 2020, late 2019, early 2020. There was a trainer that was dominating up and down the East Coast, winning an enormous percentage of races. The FBI investigated him for doping. He was found to be giving a number of non-FDA approved designer drugs that were basically created to be invisible to drug screening, some of which were basically a mimic for EPO, the same blood doping agent that Lance Armstrong admitted to using. And he had been doping this horse, and that horse ultimately dropped dead of heart arrhythmia. It was an animal named XY Jet who had won big races here in the United States and in Dubai. He was a very, very successful horse. There is no way after the fact, at least now, for scientists, for veterinarians, to toxicologists to definitively link the drugs that horse was getting to his death. It's one of the really tricky things about sudden death. It's very hard to know what the precise link is in between the animal's medication history and ultimately what happens to them. But I guess I keep returning to this point that that's a small number of horses.
I didn't realize that a lot of them were just arrhythmias and a lot might be side effects from drugs, but that it was hard to track it down. So
I wouldn't say a lot would be side effects from drugs. I would say we don't know if they are related to drugs. Now,
so that controversy, what was it? Santa Anita had a controversy of 3.
Okay, well, there's 2 Santa Anita controversies. One of them involves sudden death and one of them involves breakdown. So let's talk about the sudden death one. You probably are familiar with the trainer named Bob Baffert. He tends to be the only purebred horse trainer that anybody does. He's got the white hair and the purple sunglasses. He's won the Triple Crown twice. He's an absolutely, unquestionably dominant horse trainer. He's very good at what he does. He had a string of deaths from heart arrhythmias in the mid 2011. He had 7 horses die of heart arrhythmias, basically within about a year and a half, I think. And nobody could ever really explain why. However, it was determined after the fact that Baffert had been giving to his stable an entirely legal drug called Thyroid. It's meant to treat a thyroid condition, but at the time it was very popular among trainers in California. They were giving it to every horse in the barn. It wasn't just Bob Baffert who was doing it. And there are some indications that Thyroid, when combined with high-intensity exercise, could produce a heart arrhythmia. you can't do double-blind studies to try to make horses have heart arrhythmias, right? So it is a very, very difficult thing to sort of say definitively that's what happened. That episode remains a matter of like intense controversy across the sport. What caused this, right? I interviewed Baffert extensively about this in the course of the book. I don't think he knows, right? The top regulator who was in charge of investigating this said the same thing to me. It remains a really stubborn mystery. All the deaths were a little bit different, right? It's one of the things that makes sudden death so hard. But I think sudden death to me tends to be a little bit of a distractor from the bigger problem of breakdowns. Sudden death is such a small percentage, right? And it is, as we said, it's kind of a stubborn mystery in human athletes also, right? Breakdown issue is something that the industry has much more control over. There are ways to improve the odds that an animal will suffer a fatal injury during competition. And that was the second controversy at Santa Anita in 2019, when you may remember the headlines of 30 horses dying in a season. Those were breakdowns. Those were horses suffering a broken leg on the racetrack, and ultimately they had to be euthanized because it would be inhumane to keep them alive. In that instance, there was like 50 reasons why it happened. People are always looking for kind of a single magic bullet with breakdowns. There's no magic bullet with breakdowns. It's the track surface. It's the horse's medication history. It's potentially his breeding. It's how the horse was maintained and like trained going into a race.
So that's super interesting. It sounds like there's a big scope for also the issues of inbreeding. With dogs, German Shepherds have issues with their hips, and pugs have issue with breathing and all these kinds of things. Like, I assume there's genetic issues, and if everybody has the same daddy and same grandfather, like these genetic quirks that like an arrhythmia can be an inherited trait. It sounds like it could be just from inbreeding. Do people talk about that? Is that acknowledged?
I don't know that there's a heritability factor to arrhythmias, as in I literally don't know. That's not something that came up in my research. My suspicion is if there was evidence to suggest that there was a heritability factor, it probably would have been raised with me. So my guess is that's actually probably not.
But in horse racing breeding, if you were to do the family tree, isn't it quite a straight line?
No, certainly there is some inbreeding 3 to 4 generations back in horse racing, but, you're not seeing like, I'm going to struggle not to use the horse racing term, if I were to say, a 3x3 cross, right? It would mean, what I would be saying is that the third generation is.
It's like dating in the 1800s.
Yeah, right. You're marrying your cousin a lot. But no, you're not seeing like 2x3 crosses in horse racing, right? Like there is some inbreeding, there is some shared common ancestry, but it's further back in the.
But if you imagine, like, if you go back in human binary terms, if you think about your great times 10, you have 1,024 great 10 times grandparents, if you think about that, right? Because, you have 4 grandparents, you have 8 great grandparents, you have 16 great grandparents. Like, binary math goes crazy. But
clearly a true handicapper, because you are much better at math than I am.
I'm good at powers of 2 because it's all over computer science. But otherwise, I would need a calculator to pull that out. But my guess is if you were to look at the great grandparents of all these horses times 10, they wouldn't have 1,024 great grandparents. My guess is they would have like 50, because everybody's using the same horses.
There's actually a wheel. Oh, I wish I had this visual with me. There's like a Thoroughbred Sires of America, like historical wheel that like presents the pedigrees of horses, like as a, it shows you basically like, almost like a pie chart, the percentage of, of horses that are coming from individual bloodlines. Yes, people do occasionally talk about inbreeding. The bigger issue, I think, from a soundness perspective or a welfare perspective when it comes to breeding is there's actually a big concern in the industry that the sport has not done a good enough job of managing the stud book, which is the group of horses that are then bred, right, to ensure that you're only breeding sound horses, that you are passing along sound traits. And so the way that this is played out in practice is, let's say I have a really talented 3-year-old colt. He's real fast and he wins a couple of big races, but not like huge, amazing races. He wins like a couple of grade 2s and maybe he gets an easy grade 1, which is the top level, but against not that great a competition. He's got a little bit of a crooked leg, but you know what? Like, he looks good enough and he's got enough buzz around him. I'm going to do a stallion deal. I'm going to syndicate him, 42 share agreement. I'm going to start breeding some mares to him. And we're going to try to get out on the stallion deal. So we're going to breed 200 mares to this horse in the first couple of years. And he might not really be that high quality of a horse. And this is happening sort of across the industry because that's where the money is, right? And there are old-timey breeders in the sport who I respect enormously who think, look, what you are doing is rolling the dice because you are putting 200, 400, 600 horses into the market with, no real idea if they're really going to be sound, but they're now on the racetrack and they got to run because they got to make money. And that, I think, is one of the big concerns from like a welfare perspective on the soundness of the breed. And the reason that this is new is, here's some real like weeds history for you on horse breeding. Used to be, you could only breed about 40 mares a year because veterinary science only permitted you to breed about 40 mares a year. That was what was called a full book. So, okay, you breed a horse, you don't really know what the offspring are going to be like, but there's only 40 of them. So you're not putting that many unsound horses into the gene pool if it doesn't work out, right? But now, because of improvements in veterinary science, because you can breed 150, 200 mares a year, you're putting a lot more horses into the gene pool that you don't know whether or not they're sound enough to keep running. And they're probably going to get sold. They might even get bred because that's the only way you can make money on them is to breed them and to try to sell their offspring.
It sounds like there's a serious lack, and I'd have to see the chart, but it sounds like there's a lack of genetic diversity, which is going to make health problems worse, it sounds like. Especially if there's like, if grandpa's got 5,000 grandchildren or something.
Yeah, but there's also a lot of mares, right? So like, it's not like...
Mare means female horse, right?
All right, mare is the mama.
And how do you make sure that the stallion doesn't sire males? Are you aborting the males? You said like the stallion...
No. Okay, sorry. In order to be classified as a thoroughbred in the United States...
You need a blue ribbon.
Mommy and daddy actually have to do it. It's called live cover. That is how you ensure, that this horse is bred, that mare, and how you don't glut the marketplace with so many offspring as you would get.
Oh, you're saying he's impregnating 200 mares.
Exactly. So when I say he gets a mare, I mean he is impregnating.
And the mare may have a boy or a girl.
Right. Yeah.
That's a lot of sex ceremonies for the dad to do.
Yeah, it's like 3 mares a day during the season. My morning routine used to be walking into the office, I'd get my cup of coffee, and I'd be like, all right, so like, how's this horse's libido this morning? That was like my normal conversation.
They're good to go 3 times a day?
In the busy season, yeah, because they might have to the way the contracts are written, it's called live foal stands and nurses. So if you own the mare owner pays the stallion, right, for the right to breed their mare to his stallion. If I own the mare, I go take my horse, I determine, okay, she's in season, she's ready to go. Book her, as we say. You're going to take the mare over to the stallion. I'm not making any of this up, my friend. You drive them over to the stallion's farm. The stallion performs his duty. Mama goes home. And if she's not pregnant, then she can come back and be rebred. The money is not actually due until a live foal that stands and nurses is produced. Now, if that foal takes 2 steps out of the stall after it nurses and keels over and dies, you still owe that stud fee. But if it is stillborn, if the mare aborts at any point during the pregnancy, then no. If she never even gets pregnant, you get to come back. So my point is 200 mares a year might mean more than 200 breedings during the breeding season.
And not to be too funny about it, but doesn't the horse want to like watch Netflix and eat some grass sometimes? Like...
They are, so I will say, these stallions are taken extremely good care of. Like, you get a chiropractor, you get a veterinarian, like you got all the sports doctors in the world standing over you. But yes, it's an enormous amount of work. It's an enormous strain on their back, on their hocks, like which is the kind of the knee and the back of their leg. And I believe many other people in Kentucky would argue that 200 mares a year is probably too much. It's in a compact period of time.
Sounds intense. Sounds very intense.
It's a lot of work.
And how long does the act itself take? Is it like 2 seconds, like some species, or is there foreplay? And
depends on the horse. Well, I've seen some boys who like to come in there and take their time, and then there's some boys who are real business-like, and they just, come in, jump, flag, get her done.
Get her done. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. The book is called Death of a Racehorse. It's out shortly. The author is Katie Bo Lillis. Thanks for dropping by the podcast to talk about horse racing, educate me on this sport that we make a lot of money from. Before I let you go, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, I used to want to sell racehorses. And you know what? Now I think I'll settle for being somebody who retrains off the track thoroughbreds. I'd like to be the landed gentry, taken care of.
Very good. Very good. That sounds very nice indeed. Well, thanks for stopping by. I really enjoyed the chat.
Thanks, Jason.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.